Seoul does not sleep in winter. It just gets quieter. The Han River freezes at the edges but keeps moving in the middle, dark and patient and indifferent to the cold. The streets of Cheongdam-dong at 1 a.m. are empty in a way that feels deliberate, like the neighborhood itself has decided that only a certain kind of person belongs here after midnight. Black cars with tinted windows, men in long coats walking with purpose. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, it's paid for. This is where Kang Ji-won lives. Not an apartment, not a house. A building, 6 floors, private elevator, floor-to-ceiling glass on the top level that looks out over the Han like a throne looks over a kingdom. His name is not on any public registry. His face has never appeared in a newspaper. But every serious person in Seoul, every businessman, every politician, every person who has ever needed something done quietly, knows the name Kang Ji-won the way they know the rules of gravity. You don't see it coming, and by the time you feel it, it's already done. 36 years old, lean, precise, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace but from absolute control. His father had built the foundation, underground networks, protected supply chains, relationships with people whose names never appeared on official documents. Ji-won had inherited all of it at 28 when his father died of a stroke, and in 8 years he had tripled it. Not through violence, though violence was available to him always like a tool hanging on a wall. Through intelligence. Through patience. Through a coldness so complete it had become his identity. People in his organization did not call him boss. They called him Sajang-nim, but they said it the way you say a word you're slightly afraid of, carefully, with both hands. He had a rule, one rule that everyone around him knew and nobody questioned. Nothing personal, ever. No attachments, no relationships, no woman who stayed past morning, no friend who knew too much. His inner circle was small and professional and compensated well enough that loyalty was rational rather than emotional. He preferred it that way. Emotion was a leak, a crack in the structure. He had seen what it did to men, watched his own father make one sentimental decision that cost 6 months of careful work. Ji-won had noted it at 22 and filed it away permanently. He did not need anyone. He had built his entire world around that fact, the way you build a house around a load-bearing wall. That was Kang Ji-won. That was his world, until the night of the 21st of January, when his driver took the back route home because of black ice on the main road, and Ji-won saw something in the alley beside his building that made him tell the driver to stop. He almost didn't. His phone was in his hand, a message from his operations director waiting for a response. The convoy had slowed down, not stopped. The black ice had forced a detour through the narrow service lane that ran between his building and the empty lot next door. Nobody used that alley at this hour. His building's security cameras covered it, but it was a dead zone in terms of foot traffic. Delivery trucks in the morning, nothing else. The headlights swept across her as the car turned. She was sitting on the ground with her back against the wall, right below the security camera's blind spot. Whether by accident or some exhausted instinct, he couldn't tell. She had her arms wrapped around her knees, her face turned down and hidden. She was wearing a padded jacket that was not thick enough for January in Seoul. The kind you buy at a Dongdaemun market stall for 20,000 won because it's all you can afford, not because it will actually keep you warm. She was shaking. Not from cold alone. The shoulders were moving in that particular way, the jagged, involuntary rhythm of someone crying so hard they've stopped making sound. His driver was already slowing down. His head of security, Park Sung-ho, had his door open before the car stopped completely, one hand inside his jacket. Deji Maseo, Ji-won said it quietly, don't touch her. Sung-ho stopped, closed his door, said nothing. Ji-won sat still for exactly 4 seconds. He was aware of counting them, and then he got out of the car. The cold hit immediately. -8, maybe -10 with the wind coming off the river. His shoes were Italian leather and completely wrong for ice, but he walked steadily to where she sat, stopped 2 meters away and looked down at her. She hadn't heard him. Her face was still turned down, her natural hair, black, loose, pressed against her cheek by the cold, hiding her expression. A small duffel bag sat beside her, unzipped, a Korean textbook visible at the top. A student, then, or someone who had been one recently. He noticed her hands. The knuckles were raw, not from cold, from work. The kind of rawness that builds over months of physical labor. He said nothing for a moment, just stood. Then a gust came off the alley wall and she felt it, or felt the change in the air, and she looked up. The moment she saw him, saw the convoy, the men, the building behind him, her eyes went wide, and she was on her feet in an instant, backing against the wall, hands up slightly in that involuntary gesture of someone who has learned to be afraid of sudden things. She stared at him. He looked back at her, at this girl with the raw knuckles and the too thin jacket, and the Korean textbook in her bag and tears still drying on her face, and he waited. Most people, when they found themselves suddenly face to face with Kang Ji-won and his convoy at 1 a.m. in a dark alley, did one of two things. They apologized immediately, or they tried to explain themselves immediately. Both came from the same place, panic. The need to fill the silence before he filled it for them. She did neither. She stood against that wall, chest rising and falling, and she looked at him, really looked at him, not past him, not at the men behind him. And after a long moment she said, in Korean that was accented but clear, "Jasonghamnida, I'm sorry, Baro Galgyo, I'll leave right now." She bent down to pick up her bag. Ji-won watched her. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't get the zipper closed. She tried twice, failed twice, and on the third attempt she just held the bag against her chest and straightened up. Her chin was lifted. Her eyes were dry now, or she was forcing them to be. He could see the effort it cost her. She was not going to cry in front of him. That much was clear. She took one step to leave. "Yadiro Geo," he said. She stopped, turned slightly. "Where are you going?" The question seemed to confuse her more than his presence had. Like it was the last thing she expected from a man like him in an alley like this at this hour. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked down at her bag. Then she said, very quietly, in the most honest answer he had heard from anyone in years, "Morujuseo yo." "I don't know." The wind moved through the alley. Behind him, Sung-ho and the other men stood absolutely still, watching their boss stand in the cold talking to a crying foreign girl, understanding nothing about what they were seeing. Ji-won understood it even less. But he did not move. He stood there in -8 degrees in his Italian leather shoes, and he looked at this girl who had no plan and nowhere to go and still, had not looked away from him, and he felt something shift in a place he had spent 8 years making sure nothing could shift. He didn't have a name for it yet. He wasn't sure he wanted one. He didn't take her inside that night. That was important because later, when people in his organization whispered about how it started, they assumed he had. They assumed Kang Ji-won had seen a pretty girl in an alley and made a decision the way powerful men make certain decisions, quickly, selfishly, without explanation. That was not what happened. What happened was this. He told Sung-ho to call the building's housekeeper and have the ground floor guest unit unlocked. He told his driver to wait. He looked at the girl, who was still standing with her bag pressed against her chest, watching him with those careful, exhausted eyes, and he said, in slow and deliberate Korean so she would follow every word, "One night, the unit has a lock, nobody will bother you." She stared at him. "Why?" she asked. He had not been asked why by anyone in a very long time. His instructions moved through his organization like current through a wire, instantly, without question, without resistance. The word "why" landed in the cold air between them like something foreign. He looked at her for a moment. "-10 degrees, he said simply. "You'll be dead by morning." She looked down. He could see her thinking, the tension across her shoulders, the slight movement of her jaw. She was calculating something. Risk, probably. What it would cost her to accept something from a man like him, whether the cold was worse than the debt. She was smart enough to know that nothing was free, especially not from men with convoys. "I don't owe you anything after," she said quietly, not aggressive, just clear. Something moved at the corner of Ji-won's mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the recognition of something unexpected. "No," he said, "you don't." Her name was Amara. Amara Chukwu, 23 years old, from Enugu, Nigeria. She had come to Seoul 14 months ago on a student visa, enrolled in a Korean language program at a small private institute in Mapogu, and worked 2 part-time jobs to cover tuition and a room in a gashiwon, one of those tiny, cupboard-sized rooms that students and migrants rented in old buildings where the walls were thin and the communal bathroom was down the hall. Ji-won did not learn all of this that night. He learned it in pieces, over days, the way you learn things about a person who is careful about what they give away. What he learned that first morning was simpler. His housekeeper, Mrs. Yoon, a sharp, efficient woman in her 60s who had worked for the Kang family for 20 years and was therefore unimpressed by most things, came to him after breakfast with a neutral expression and said that the girl in the guest unit had been awake since 5 a.m., that she had washed her own bedsheet by hand in the bathroom sink and hung it neatly over the shower rail, that she had asked, very politely, whether there was any cleaning or work she could do in exchange for the night's stay. Ji-won had been reading a contract. He stopped reading. "She asked to work." "3 times," Mrs. Yoon said, with the faint tone of someone who was slightly impressed despite themselves. He set the contract down. He told Mrs. Yoon to send her in. She looked different in daylight. Still tired, the shadows under her eyes hadn't gone anywhere but composed. She had changed into the only other outfit in her bag, a simple white blouse and dark trousers, and she stood in the doorway of his study with her hands clasped in front of her and her chin at that same angle he had noticed in the alley. Not defiant, not submissive. Just level. "You wanted to work," he said. "I don't take things I haven't earned," she said. "You're a student." "I was." A pause. "My institute closed 3 weeks ago. The owner took the fees and disappeared. My visa status is—" She stopped, started again. "Complicated right now." Ji-won looked at her steadily. A foreign student in Seoul on a now-invalid visa, no institution, no income, no room, because he understood now why she had been in that alley with everything she owned in one bag. The gashiwon landlord would have moved fast once her payment stopped. "You have no status," he said, not unkindly, just precise. "Not yet," she said. "I'm fixing it." "How?" "I'm looking for a new registered institution to transfer my visa. I have an appointment at the immigration office on Thursday. I have enough saved for 1 more month if I find work." She said it all evenly, like a report, like she had recited it to herself so many times it had become a kind of armor. Ji-won was quiet for a moment. He thought about sending her to a hotel, giving her an envelope of cash, telling Mrs. Yoon to handle it, removing her from his building and his morning the way you remove a variable from an equation you're trying to simplify. That was the logical move. Clean, uncomplicated. He thought about it. Then he said, "Mrs. Yoon needs help with the household records, filing, organizing, scheduling suppliers. It requires Korean and English." Amara looked at him carefully. "I speak both." "I know, I heard you last night." A beat of silence. "This isn't charity," he said before she could respond. "The work is real. Mrs. Yoon will tell you if it isn't done correctly. You stay in the guest unit until your visa situation is resolved. After that, you find your own arrangements." She was quiet for a long moment. He watched her decide, watched her weigh pride against reality with the focused expression of someone who had done that calculation many times and had learned, painfully, which one to choose. "Okay," she said. "Then, thank you." She said it simply, without decoration. The way people say thank you when they actually mean it rather than when they're performing gratitude for someone powerful. Jiwon nodded once and returned to his contract. But after she left the room, he did not read a single word of it. He sat with his pen in his hand and the page in front of him, and he stared at nothing. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in a place he kept locked and climate-controlled and strictly unvisited, something was beginning to thaw. He didn't acknowledge it. Not yet. The first week, she was invisible. Not literally. Mrs. Yoon had her moving through the building from 8 a.m., organizing the supplier records in the basement office, cross-referencing delivery invoices, updating the household calendar in a shared system that had apparently not been properly maintained in 8 months. She worked quietly and without complaint, and when Mrs. Yoon corrected her, she listened, nodded once, and did not make the same mistake twice. Jiwon knew all of this because Mrs. Yoon told him, not because he asked. He didn't ask. Mrs. Yoon simply reported it the way she reported everything about the household, briefly, at breakfast, with the expressionless efficiency of someone who understood that information was more useful than opinion. What Mrs. Yoon did not report, because it was not the kind of thing Mrs. Yoon reported, was the smaller things. The way Amara hummed very softly when she was alone in the basement office, some melody Jiwon didn't recognize, low and unhurried, the kind of sound a person makes when they feel briefly safe. He heard it once when he came down to retrieve a physical file his operations team needed. He stood outside the door for a moment before he opened it, not deliberately, just the natural pause before entering a room, and he heard it through the door and felt something he had no framework for. He opened the door. She stopped immediately, straightening at the desk. "Sajang-nim." "Third shelf blue binder," he said. She found it in 4 seconds, handed it to him without a word. He left. On the elevator back up, he realized his jaw had been tight for the past hour and was no longer. He noted that the way he noted everything, quietly, without reaction, and filed it somewhere he didn't intend to open. The first crack happened on a Wednesday. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing about real moments, they rarely announced themselves. They arrived sideways, dressed as something ordinary. One of his supply chain managers, a man named Director Lim, had come to the building for a meeting. Lim was 51, old school, the kind of man who had worked in Jiwon's father's time, and considered that history a kind of entitlement. He was good at his job and aware of it, and had developed, over the years, a habit of moving through the building with a casualness that other staff did not permit themselves. Amara was in the hallway outside the meeting room, carrying a tray with tea service for the afternoon meeting. She had her head slightly down, focused on not spilling anything. The tray was heavy. The hallway floor was polished marble. Lim came around the corner without looking. The collision was minor, a shoulder against hers. The tray tilted. One cup slid and shattered on the floor, tea spreading across the marble in a dark bloom. What happened next was the part that mattered. Lim looked at the broken cup, then at Amara, and his face arranged itself into an expression that Jiwon, who had come out of the meeting room at the sound of breaking porcelain, recognized immediately. The expression of a man who has decided, in under 1 second, that something is someone else's fault. "Aish," Lim began, the irritation already sharpening into something harder. "Do you not watch where you—" "Director Lim." Jiwon's voice was not loud. It never needed to be. The hallway went very still. Lim turned, saw Jiwon standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, and that particular quality of stillness that his staff understood meant something was being measured and assessed and decided, all at once, very quickly, and not in your favor. "She was carrying a full tray," Jiwon said. "You came around a blind corner." Lim's expression shifted through several phases in rapid succession: surprise, recalculation, something close to embarrassment. Sajang Nim, I was just. Have someone bring a replacement set, Jiwon said, to no one in particular, because in his building there was always someone close enough to hear. Then he looked at Lim with an expression that closed the subject permanently. The meeting starts in 4 minutes. Lim straightened his jacket and walked into the meeting room without another word. The hallway emptied. Amara crouched down and began carefully picking up the porcelain pieces. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed in that particular way he had come to recognize, the deliberate composure of someone who has learned to process things internally and quickly, because showing it costs too much. He crouched down beside her. She looked up surprised. He picked up the largest piece of the broken cup and placed it on the tray without a word. They stayed like that for a brief moment, both crouched on the marble floor of his hallway, the cold winter light coming through the end window, the building silent around them. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Not about the cup, about Lim. He was wrong, Jiwon said simply. Men like him are always wrong, she said, and there was no bitterness in it, just a matter-of-fact tiredness that landed harder than bitterness would have. That doesn't usually stop them. Jiwon looked at her. She wasn't looking for pity. She wasn't performing resilience either, that practiced, slightly too bright strength people put on when they want you to know they're okay. She was just stating a fact, something she had filed away a long time ago under the way things are and continued living around. He didn't respond, but something in his chest shifted, not gently, not quietly. Something that had been set very firmly, for a very long time, moved. The physical spark came 3 days later, and it arrived, like most real things do, without warning. It had snowed overnight. Not heavily, Seoul's winter snow was usually thin and apologetic, gone by afternoon, but enough to coat the courtyard and the narrow stone steps that led from the side entrance down to the building's lower garden. The steps were beautiful and completely treacherous. Amara used that entrance every morning because it was closer to the basement office. Jiwon knew this because he knew the movement patterns of everyone in his building, not surveillance, just the natural awareness of a man who had survived this long by paying attention. He was coming up the steps as she was coming down. She didn't see the ice until her foot was already on it. The slip was fast, her right foot going sideways, her body tilting, that split second where the brain knows what's happening before it can do anything about it. And then his hand was around her wrist, his other hand catching her elbow, and she was upright, her free hand gripping the front of his coat without thinking. They stayed like that. Her breath came out in a cloud in the cold air. His was steady. Her hand was still gripping his coat, fingers curled into the wool, not quite letting go. He could feel her pulse through the wrist he was holding, faster than it should be, even accounting for the near fall. His was not entirely steady either. He noticed that. She looked up at him, closer than they had ever been, close enough that he could see the snowflake that had landed on her eyelash and not yet melted, close enough that the careful composure she always wore had slipped, just slightly, in the shock of the moment. And what was underneath it was something open and unguarded and real. For 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. Then she released his coat, stepped back, pulled her wrist gently from his hand. "Careful," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended. "I know," she said softly. "Thank you." She continued down the steps, one hand on the wall, not looking back. Jiwon stood on the steps in the cold, for a moment longer than necessary. His right hand, the one that had held her wrist, he closed slowly into a fist at his side. Then he walked inside. She found out on a Thursday. Not from him, not from Mrs. Yoon, from a junior staff member who said it the way people say things they know will hurt, casually, with just enough innocence to avoid accountability. "Did you know the Sajangnim is getting married?" Amara was in the basement office when she heard it. The girl, one of the household assistants, barely 20, who had been watching Amara with a mixture of curiosity and quiet resentment for 2 weeks, said it while refilling the paper tray on the printer. Like it was nothing. Like it was weather. His father arranged it years ago. The woman is from the Seo family, very old money. The announcement is next month apparently. Amara said nothing. She kept her eyes on the screen in front of her and continued typing and waited for the girl to leave. When the door closed, she stopped typing. She sat very still for a moment, her hands in her lap, looking at nothing. Then she exhaled slowly. Good, she told herself. Good. This is good information to have. She meant it, or she told herself she meant it. Because whatever had been quietly growing inside her chest over the past 3 weeks, whatever warmth had been gathering around the memory of his hand on her wrist, and his voice in that hallway and the way he sometimes looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't expected and couldn't stop thinking about, that needed to stop. Right now. Before it became something she couldn't manage. She was a foreign girl with a complicated visa, living in his building, working for his housekeeper. He was Kang Ji-won. She knew exactly what that meant. She was quieter after that. Ji-won noticed within 24 hours. He noticed the way he noticed everything about her now against his will, with a precision that irritated him. The humming had stopped. She still worked well, still responded to Mrs. Yoon without complaint, still carried herself with that same level steadiness. But something had pulled back, a warmth that he hadn't even consciously registered until it was no longer there. He didn't ask. He told himself it was not his concern. He lasted 4 days. He found her on the rooftop terrace on a Sunday evening, which surprised him because no staff used the rooftop. She was standing at the railing with her coat pulled tight, looking out over the Han River, the city lights spreading below them in the dark like a second sky. She didn't hear him come up. The door was heavy and the wind took the sound. He stood behind her for a moment. Then, you've been avoiding me. She turned, composed immediately, that rapid reassembly he had watched her do a dozen times. I have work to finish in the... Amara. She stopped. He almost never used her name. She felt it land differently when he did, felt it in her sternum, which she deeply resented. Congratulations, she said quietly, on the engagement. Something moved across his face, fast, almost invisible. Who told you? It doesn't matter. It wasn't announced. Then I'll forget I heard it. She turned back to the railing. Good night, Sajingnim. He didn't move. The wind came off the river and pushed between them. Below, Seoul hummed and glittered, indifferent. It was my father's arrangement, he said finally, not mine. That's not my business, she said. Her voice was even. Her hands on the railing were not. I know, he said. I'm telling you anyway. She turned to look at him then, really look at him, the way she had in the alley that first night, searching for something. He held her gaze and didn't look away and didn't offer anything more than the truth he had already said. The city stretched endlessly behind him. She looked down first. It doesn't change anything, she said softly. Whether she meant it for him or for herself, neither of them was entirely sure. She walked past him to the door. His hand moved almost. A reflex he caught and stopped and stood very still after, staring at the river, jaw tight, something breaking open in his chest that he no longer had the energy to hold closed. It happened on a night when neither of them planned it. Which was the only way it could have happened, because if either of them had seen it coming they would have moved in opposite directions, and the distance between them would have become permanent and polite and completely unbearable. It was late, past midnight. Ji-won had been in his study since 9 p.m. working through a contract restructure that required his personal attention, the kind of work that couldn't be delegated, that lived in the details, that demanded a quality of focus he usually had no problem summoning. Tonight he couldn't summon it. He had read the same clause 4 times. Each time his mind slid off the words like water off glass and landed, without permission, on a rooftop, on hands gripping a railing, on a voice saying it doesn't change anything with a steadiness that didn't match the knuckles. He closed the folder. He went to the kitchen for water, something he never did. He had staff for that, but it was midnight and the building was quiet and he didn't want to call anyone. The kitchen was at the end of the east wing, large and steel and immaculate. The kind of kitchen that existed to be functional rather than warm. Amara was sitting at the far end of the kitchen counter. She had a mug in front of her and a Korean grammar textbook open beside it, a pencil moving slowly down a column of vocabulary. She was mouthing the words silently as she read them, the way serious language learners do, letting the mouth remember what the brain is still learning. She hadn't heard him. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She was wearing a simple gray sweatshirt, her hair loose around her shoulders. No performance of composure because she didn't know anyone was watching. This was just her, tired and studying at midnight in a kitchen that wasn't hers, preparing for a future she was still trying to build from the ground up. Something in his chest became completely undone. "You study at midnight," he said. She looked up fast, startled, her pencil rolling off the counter. "Sajang Nim, I'm sorry, I thought everyone was." "Don't apologize," he said. He walked to the counter, picked up the pencil, set it beside her book. He didn't move away. She looked up at him carefully. "I couldn't sleep," she offered. "Neither could I," he said. Silence settled between them, but a different kind of silence than before. Not careful, not managed. The kind that happens when two people have run out of the energy required to pretend. He pulled out the stool across from her and sat down. She watched him do it like she wasn't sure it was real. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Ji-won said, quietly, looking at the counter rather than at her, "My father built this organization on the idea that nothing personal survives in this world. That attachment is a liability. That the moment you need someone, really need them, you've handed them a weapon." Amara said nothing. She was very still. "I believed that," he said. "For a long time I believed it completely. And then you were sitting in my alley in a jacket that couldn't keep out the cold, and you looked at me and told me you didn't know where you were going, and I have not been able to think correctly since." The kitchen was very quiet. "Ji-won," she said, and then stopped, because she had used his name without the honorific, without thinking, and she felt the air change when she did. He looked up. "I have tried," he said, "to make this into something manageable, something I can organize and contain and understand. I cannot. You are in every room I walk into before you're there. I hear you in the building and my chest does something I have no language for." He paused. "I am not good at this. I want you to know that. I don't have softness easily. I don't have warmth on demand. But whatever this is," he looked at her steadily, "I am not willing to close the door on it. Not for my father's arrangement, not for anything." Amara looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were bright, not crying, holding it, the way she always held everything, right at the edge, with that fierce, quiet dignity that had undone him from the very first night. "You scare me," she said honestly. "I know," he said. "I scare most people." "Not like that." She shook her head slightly. "You scare me because I came to this country with nothing and I have been so careful not to want things I cannot afford to want." Her voice dropped. "And then you crouched down on your own hallway floor to help me pick up broken pieces." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything unsaid over 5 weeks, every charged hallway, every averted gaze, every moment one of them had pulled back from the edge just in time. Ji-won reached across the counter slowly, his hand steady in operating rooms, steady in boardrooms, steady in rooms where most men's hands shook, covered hers. She looked down at it, then up at him. "I don't know what your world costs," she whispered. "I know," he said quietly. "Stay anyway." She turned her hand over slowly beneath his, laced her fingers through his fingers. Outside, Soul hummed on, indifferent, glittering, unaware. The Han River moved in the dark the way it always moved, patient, continuous, unhurried by the cold. Inside, in a steel kitchen at half past midnight, something that had been trying to happen for 5 weeks finally, quietly, did. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Ji-won was in a meeting when his personal phone, not the work phone, the private one whose number fewer than 6 people in the world had, vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen. His father. He let it ring. It rang again 20 minutes later, then a third time. By the fourth call, Ji-won excused himself, walked to the window at the end of the corridor, and answered. "She needs to leave your building," his father said. No greeting, no preamble. Kang Byung-ho had not used pleasantries in 30 years. Ji-won was quiet for a moment. "Who told you?" "It doesn't matter who told me. What matters is that you are keeping a foreign girl with a visa problem in your private residence, and people are starting to talk. Let them." The silence on the other end was the particular silence of a man controlling his temper. "Ji-won, the Seo family has heard. Chairman Seo called me this morning. The engagement was your arrangement," Ji-won said, "not mine. It is a commitment that I never made." His father's voice dropped, quiet and cold and very precise, the voice Ji-won had inherited, the voice that meant the conversation had moved past negotiation. "End it. Send her away, or I will make her situation here significantly more difficult than it already is." The line went dead. Ji-won stood at the window for a long time. Below, Seoul moved in its relentless way, traffic, people, the ordinary machinery of a city that didn't care about any of this. He thought about what his father's interference looked like in practice. He knew exactly what it looked like. A visa application flagged. An immigration appointment missed due to a clerical error that wasn't a clerical error. A door closed quietly from a distance, by a hand nobody could trace. His father was very good at closed doors. He didn't tell Amara that night. He told himself he needed to think first, to have a plan before he brought her into it. That was how he operated. Never present a problem without a solution already forming. But she read him the way she had always read him, quietly, accurately, without announcement. They were in the kitchen again, which had become their place without either of them formally deciding that. She looked at his face when he sat down and she said, "What happened?" Not a question, a statement. He looked at her across the counter, at this woman who had arrived in his alley with everything she owned in one bag, and had somehow, in 6 weeks, become the clearest thing in his life, and he told her the truth. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, the way she processed difficult things, inward first, then outward. "I should go," she said softly. "No," he said. G1. "No," firmer, final. "That is not the solution." She looked at him with those careful eyes. "Your father has real power over my situation here. You know that." "So do I," he said quietly. He moved fast. That was how G1 operated when a decision was made, not impulsively, but with the compressed, precise speed of someone who had already done all the thinking and was now simply executing. The first call he made was to his personal lawyer, a woman named Choi Yuri, 44, who had handled the Kang family's legal architecture for 12 years and was unshockable by professional obligation. He told her what he needed. She asked 3 clarifying questions, made 2 observations, and told him she could have the documentation framework ready within 72 hours. The second call was to a contact at the Immigration Bureau. Not a corrupt contact, just a thorough one. Someone who understood that certain cases deserved careful attention and correct processing, rather than the casual negligence that swallowed thousands of foreign students every year. The third call was the one that mattered most. His father answered on the second ring. "I've ended the CO arrangement," Ji-won said. "Chairman CO will receive a formal communication from my office today. I take full responsibility for the disruption." Silence. "You are making," his father said slowly, "a very serious mistake." "I've made very few mistakes in 8 years," Ji-won said. "You know that. Trust that I am not making one now." "She is nobody." "She is the person I have chosen," Ji-won said. "That makes her somebody. I won't have this conversation again." He ended the call. He sat in his study afterward in complete silence for several minutes. He was aware of the weight of what he had just done, not with regret, but with the full clarity of a man who has set something irreversible in motion and is at peace with it. The CO connection had business implications. His father's disapproval had organizational implications. None of it changed anything. He had spent 8 years building walls and calling it strength. He understood now, with a precision that felt almost clinical, that he had been wrong. He found her in the basement office. She was working, of course she was working. She was always working, her pencil moving down a column of figures, her textbook open beside the household ledger like she was running 2 lives simultaneously, which she essentially was. She looked up when he came in. He closed the door behind him, pulled the chair across from her desk and sat down and looked at her directly. "It's done," he said. "The engagement is terminated. Choi Yuri is building a legal pathway for your visa, a legitimate one, properly filed, properly supported. It will take 6 weeks. You will not be touched in the meantime." Amara set her pencil down slowly. "Your father is angry," Ji-won said. "He'll remain angry for a while, that's his right." "You did this for me," she said. It wasn't quite a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. It was the sound of someone trying to absorb something too large to absorb quickly. "I did it for myself," he said honestly. "I did it because the alternative was going back to the version of my life I had before you, and I am not willing to do that." Her eyes were bright again, that familiar brightness she always held right at the edge. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "I came here with nothing," she said quietly. "I want you to really understand that. No family money, no connections, no safety net, just me." "I know," he said. "That doesn't intimidate you." "It is," he said, "the least intimidating thing about you." She laughed then, a real laugh, sudden and warm, the kind that changed her whole face. He had heard it before, rare and unguarded, and it did to him now what it had always done. Something in his chest simply gave way. He reached across the desk. She took his hand. 3 months later, Kang Byung-ho came to the building. Not announced, not invited. He simply appeared one Saturday morning the way powerful men sometimes appeared, as if the normal rules of access didn't apply to them. Mrs. Yoon brought him to the sitting room and came to find Ji-won with her customary neutral expression, though he noticed she had straightened her jacket slightly, which was her version of concern. Amara was in the kitchen when Ji-won went to meet his father. She knew who had arrived, the building had told her in its own way, the slight adjustment in atmosphere, the way the staff moved more carefully. She stayed in the kitchen and did not listen at doors and focused on breathing slowly and steadily. 20 minutes passed. Then the sitting room door opened, and footsteps came down the corridor, 2 sets, not one. Kang Byung-ho appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was in his 70s, silver-haired, with his son's stillness, and his son's eyes, that same quality of seeing everything and revealing nothing. He looked at Amara for a long moment. She stood up from the counter, straight back, chin level, not performing courage, just refusing to perform fear. He studied her the way he had probably studied 1,000 people, across 1,000 negotiating tables. Then something shifted in his face. Small, almost invisible, the particular shift of a man who has come prepared for one thing and found another. My son tells me, he said slowly, that you have been studying Korean for 14 months. Yes, she said. He tells me you learned the household accounting system in 3 days. 4, she said honestly. The third day I made errors. Something moved at the corner of Byung-ho's mouth, the ghost of something. He looked at his son, who was standing slightly behind him, watching. Then he looked back at Amara. Sit down, he said, and pulled out the stool across from her himself, and sat down heavily, like a man setting down something he had been carrying a long way. Tell me, he said, about Enugu. Outside, the Han River moved in its patient way. The winter was loosening, not gone, not yet, but the edges were softening. The ice at the riverbanks was thinning. Somewhere in the city, spring was already making its quiet plans. Inside the kitchen, Amara began to talk. And Kang Byung-ho, the man who had built an empire on the principle that nothing personal survived, leaned forward slightly and listened.